Hello and welcome to another episode of Virtual Legality. I'm your host, Richard Hoeg, managing member of the Hoeg Law Business Law Firm of Northville, Michigan. And today what we're going to talk about is something a little different. Many of you came into the comments to my videos either from this week or last month into my DMs, onto my social media, and asked me one simple question. Rick, what do you think about what's happening in the world today? And of course, they're referring to the protests, the riots, the violence, and of course, the tragic death of George Floyd. And to be honest with you, I wanted to take a little time to reflect on that question. I never like to speak out of turn, and ultimately, this is a difficult question for someone in my blessed position to answer. I've had a very generous life. I've been able to succeed, to go to very good schools, to be a lawyer here in the United States, and just those things give me a certain amount of insulation from the unfortunate realities of what goes on every day. And so I wanted to really take my time with this. You might have seen earlier that I did a video called Reflections on a Changing World at the start of the COVID-19 lockdown. And that video is going to be a little bit like this one insofar as we're not going to dive into legalities. We're not going to talk about statutory code, contract provisions, or, anything fun. Obviously, that's the fun. That's why you're here in Virtual Legality, of course. But what we are going to talk about are basically my thoughts on these things as a lawyer, as someone that's reaching, unfortunately, middle age and has seen certain amounts of things in the country. And YouTube tells me that a lot of my viewers are younger and maybe haven't seen necessarily as much. And so if you're checking out this video, I very much appreciate it. It's going to be a little bit slower. It's going to be a little bit more reflective. And you're going to hear my thoughts on what this means and what we should do about it and why it happened and how I think more than just the groups that you might have already been hearing about in the media are complicit in how we arrived here at this point. So with that as the prelude, let's dive in. I think if you've been in Virtual Legality for any length of time, you know that I hate the abuse of law. I am regularly covering corporations. I'm a corporate lawyer. We try to talk about it through a lens of positivity, things that we are interested in because we are interested in the content that these companies produce, media, video games, movies, television. I just recently finished a series called The Last of Us Legalities, hopefully finished, you never know, in which we talked about Sony abusing the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And obviously, that's not the same as physical violence. That's not the same as riots and things of that nature in the street. But I think it's a good analog. I think it's a good corollary to how I feel about these things. If you watch this series, you know how passionate I got, certainly in the middle of it, when Sony just kept hitting people for reasons that really didn't seem to comport with the law. I absolutely hate forces that abuse the rule of law. I'm a lawyer. I believe in society's structures and how they can definitely be better fit to provide justice for all, but certainly how different powerful groups like large multinational corporations and unfortunately like the state can seize those levers of power and really abuse those that don't have that same access. I have long thought that because of the way our society is structured, the biggest danger in real life, not talking about corporations or property or anything of that nature, is contact with the state, right? I regularly advise my clients on how to try to make sure that various regulatory bodies aren't going to be upset about what appears in their contracts, how they deal with those bodies. And in real life, outside of corporations and contracts, that means not having contact with the police. That contact with the police, whatever form it might take, is inherently dangerous. These are the folks that society has given permission to hassle other folks, to cage those folks, and ultimately to kill those folks. We depend on their judgment to decide what, if anything, they should do about a particular circumstance. And yes, law enforcement is needed in a society of laws, but we need to be very cautious about what powers we give to those that we choose to allow us to police ourselves. And not only those powers, but the way in which those folks that have been vested with those powers think about what they have been given. And unfortunately, through a series of events that go beyond, in general, our lifetime. Certainly my lifetime, probably the majority of the folks listening to this video or watching it on YouTube. Judicial immunity standards, various other contracts have created a situation in which the police very often don't have to worry about what they really probably should be worrying about. If you aren't familiar with this doctrine, qualified immunity, which thankfully is being reviewed by the Supreme Court right now. They might actually take up a case today, of all days, to look at qualified immunity. This doctrine says that when a state or federal official, most prominently the police, do something that would otherwise violate your civil rights, imprison you, kill you, obviously is a big violation of your civil rights, they don't necessarily have to be liable for that violation if it wasn't completely obvious, clearly established that what they were doing violated those civil rights. And this is a judicially created doctrine. This was the Supreme Court that came up with this, that said, hey, if we aren't entirely sure whether or not the officer in question could have known that they were violating somebody's constitutional rights, then they shouldn't be punished for it. But the end result of that kind of doctrine is that you get police officers and police departments and various other officials, this isn't limited solely to the police, that don't do the proper thinking about what the risk-reward analysis should be in a given situation. They don't have to worry about incurring that liability. And so you get situations where if something isn't identical in the case law, the police might get off scot-free. And not only will they get off scot-free, they might not even have what they did wrong set as a constitutional standard in the very case that was brought against them. So you have this kind of spiral of situations where the police don't necessarily have to worry about the same kind of thing that you or I would worry about. Now, there's certainly a reason to give certain amounts of deference to police officers and others enforcing the law out in the field because they're dealing with dynamic and wide-ranging situations, and you don't want them to necessarily be worrying about the impact in the future on their careers or potentially their livelihoods about taking this step to save someone, to protect someone. But ultimately, this doctrine has gone too far. This doctrine has resulted in somebody putting a knee on someone's neck for 8 minutes and not having to necessarily worry about the consequences. Now, as it turns out, that particular officer is currently facing, I believe it's a murder 3 charge in Minnesota, and a number of people asked me to kind of opine on those kinds of things. I will tell you that statutory charges in the various states in the country are heavily reliant on the case law in those states. So I would recommend seeking out a Minnesota lawyer to actually ask that question to. I looked at the statute. It seemed to me like murder 2 might be in play and maybe was a better charge for what we saw on video. But certainly those folks that are aiming for murder 1, it didn't seem to match up with that. That kind of premeditation element doesn't generally exist in a stop like what we saw in this particular case. And certainly those prosecutors, the various officials in Minnesota and elsewhere around the country want to be sure not to overcharge, because one thing that can happen is if you overcharge someone for a crime, they might just get off scot-free. You have to try to aim your charge at the elements that you think that you can prove. In a similar kind of vein, we have long lived with public sector police union contracts that many studies now have shown are helping to prevent what needs to be disciplinary action on the part of these police precincts and departments at all. We've got an article up here from the Duke Law Journal, and we don't read these in Virtual Legality. I will certainly link this so that you can read it all for yourself if you'd like, but the first paragraph basically says what this article is about. It says, this article empirically demonstrates that police departments' internal disciplinary procedures, often established through the collective bargaining process, can serve as barriers to officer accountability. So with the combination of things like qualified immunity and public sector unions and the idolization of police forces, the heroes in blue, and we need them all to come home safely, and all these various kinds of things, it has resulted in the worst of both worlds. It has resulted in a world in which the police are very often totally willing to slam someone's head into the ground and totally unwilling to protect even their own precinct from burning to the ground, because they don't know the proper procedure for actually dealing with the situations that we're dealing with in the United States right now. And certainly you see that writ large with how the police has responded in certain instances, right? And none of these pictures, these are all public domain pictures. I didn't want to sensationalize or otherwise use the violence and what we're seeing today out in the streets for purposes of a YouTube video. So this is all public domain imagery. I apologize for that, but I really just didn't want just pictures of violence and that kind of glorification necessarily to be a part of this commentary. So if you are looking for those, I think you know where to find them. A lot of coverage on the news, in the news, on Twitter, wherever else you might want to look, that you can look for that imagery. But ultimately, because the police is overly militarized, because they haven't had this disciplinary function that people in the private sector might otherwise have to deal with, or liability for really damaging someone, violating their civil rights, killing them, you get a police force that might be 90% good apples and 10% bad apples, whatever it might be, but one that is completely unequipped to deal with what we see today and to otherwise be in a position to have folks in these various societies and cities and counties believe in them, have faith in them. And so you've got the same police that can murder someone and not look the other way, not be able to protect these stores and these people, and are otherwise somewhat making a big deal out of themselves. If you've seen videos about how they're trying to enforce curfews around the country, it's not anything that anybody should be proud of, either on the police force side or on the side that is otherwise advocating for violence. Now, I believe that this has been a fact of life for a long period of time. Certainly as long as I have been alive, I have been following these kinds of stories for my entire career and have been reading about them in various periodicals and news magazines and looked at, data charts and things along those lines. The police have been protected by qualified immunity and otherwise acting like they don't necessarily have to answer to the citizenry, which they have been sworn to protect for a long time. I believe that this outrage is justified and has been justified for a long time, but I also don't want to see that outrage co-opted. I don't want to see it taken over by forces that are merely anarchist or that have other agendas. I think the time for police reform is now. It is appropriate, but we have to be very careful about not dovetailing it with other kind of political messaging that maybe isn't as appropriate. And I think that's some of what is happening today, and it's one of the reasons why you get kind of a knee-jerk response from various corners of the internet. I think everybody can agree this situation was tragic and horrible, and we can see it writ large on our video screens, and something needs to be done. And I think one of the things that needs to be done is to not allow this situation, this legitimate tragedy, this outrage to be co-opted by forces beyond our control. I also think that politicians have been complicit in what we are seeing today. Not just the judiciary, not just those folks that put qualified immunity in place, not just those folks that negotiated the public sector collectively bargained union contracts that have resulted in at least some of this, but also those politicians that were looking at things like the COVID-19 lockdowns. I truly believe that part of what we are seeing today is 3 months of lockdown and of a situation which looked for all the world like people's futures were being taken from them, that unemployment has skyrocketed to Great Depression kind of levels, that the things that you would ordinarily look forward to that are light nothings, leisure activities, March Madness, E3, that big blockbuster movie that you want to see, even that Netflix series that you just wanted to stream, they're all being put on hold. And so what you had was bottled up emotions. And in my opinion, a lot of that, the lockdown, the response, I stand by much of that. But the politicians, as things progressed, as you moved into month 2, as you moved into the second or third weeks, it was beholden upon them to explain the reasoning behind what they were doing, to help try to keep a light at the end of the tunnel, to keep hope alive for these folks. And unfortunately, what you saw over the past few weeks or months was a divisiveness, a politicization of the question that resulted in a kind of, if you're not with us, you're against us. People that don't wear masks are killing folks out in the streets. And now, interestingly, that argument has pretty much gone by the wayside in the wake of these protests and riots. But ultimately, I think that the government, the politicians, the governors across the country need to be held at least partially responsible for not doing a better job in helping people down a glide path for what a lockdown like this meant, that things would return to normal ultimately, to be that voice in the darkness, that light in the darkness, and to help folks deal with the situation, a situation that none of us have ever seen in our lives before. And I think that's part of this story. I also think that lawyers are complicit, right? And I think that that's probably going to be one of the headline items if this winds up getting shared around, is that Hoeg Law, a lawyer in Michigan, thinks that lawyers are complicit. I think for a very long time, the practice of law has been largely exclusionary, and has been limiting the access to justice, which is a big code phrase that you might hear in lawyerly circles, has been limiting that access in order to be protectionist, in order to keep billable rates high, in order to keep whatever kind of prestige they would like to attach to the legal profession, the practice of law. They've prohibited good business minds from running law firms. They've prohibited good advertising minds from advertising the presence of legal services out in the marketplace. They've prevented the internet and technology from expanding the bounds about what a lawyer can do for a prospective client. And ultimately, what that has led to is an entire generation, an entire group of people, of citizens in this country not being able to afford, maybe not even knowing what a lawyer can do for them. And when we start talking about the violation of civil rights, we start talking about groups of people that are essentially preyed upon by police forces that know that they aren't going to be able to get the justice that they would otherwise be deserving of in the American justice system. That's because of cost. That's because of availability. That's because the legal system still requires faxes and maybe phono records, if you're familiar with our copyright conversations. But they don't allow high technology to actually connect lawyers with prospective clients. What you see on your screen right now is actually a task force that I was on last year for the State Bar of Michigan, designed to help bring the legal profession into the future, designed to allow this internet activity, this technology, to get more justice to more people more often, and maybe to combat some of the things that we are seeing today. Now, it may come as no surprise to you, but this task force effectively dissolved in acrimony and fighting because of people like me that wanted to see the protection racket broken. And unfortunately, that task force hasn't picked up since it dissolved last year. Now, I think it will. I think COVID-19 is a part of that story as well. But there are friction points in the legal profession. They don't want to see it opened up. They don't want to see more people receive that access to justice because ultimately, you have a higher supply, you lower that billable rate. Maybe you don't make as much profit. You don't make as much money. I'm starting to sound like Jerry Maguire here, but it's the truth. And so I think the legal profession is complicit because if folks like George Floyd, if folks like those that are preyed upon by the forces beyond their control, not just the police, but the state in general, prosecutor's office, attorneys general, could get better legal help, could get more access to justice, we might not be looking at the same kind of abuses that we are looking at today. I also believe that corporations don't have feelings. If you're on Twitter right now, you're probably seeing a lot of different corporations saying things like you are seeing on your screen from Naughty Dog, or maybe like you are seeing on your screen from Sony or Disney or what have you. If you've been in this space in virtual legality, you know these corporations don't have feelings. They don't have thoughts. They don't really have political messages that they seek to espouse. What they have are officers that are trying to do their best, trying to meet their fiduciary duties, their obligations to maximize the revenue for their investor dollars in their corporation. There is nothing wrong with that. That is what the law has charged them with. That is their obligation to the people that chose to give them money. But when you see things like this, when you see messages like this, there are a couple of responses that are appropriate. First of all, it's the acknowledgement that this corporation doesn't believe anything. What this corporation believes is that you believe that this message is important. This is marketing. And again, I'm not sitting here. I'm a corporate lawyer. I'm not sitting here to tell you that this is wrong. This is what these corporations are doing, and you should take it with that grain of salt. Now, the good news there is that they think this is important. They think this is what you want to hear. Now, don't expect them to do much about it other than tweet and put JPEG images in their tweets showing how serious they are. but it does mean that they think that there's been a sea change, that the majority of their customer base believes in this message. And if you believe in this message, that's a good thing. But you shouldn't start just thinking that Disney or Naughty Dog or Sony or any of a 2 more dozen companies that I saw on my Twitter feed believe anything in particular. If they thought their consumer base thought the opposite, you would see the opposite JPEG. They don't have beliefs. They aren't people. Their officers are people. Their officers might have beliefs. And if you are looking at somebody smaller, I saw a similar message come out from Easy Allies over the weekend. I think that's probably closer to their individual beliefs. Even there's 8 of them, I think, in that group. And it's probably not the case that all 8 exactly believe the exact language that was put forth in their tweets on these kinds of things. They believe that it is important to go out there as their brand, but it doesn't necessarily mean that each individual believes that as well. In kind of the same breath, you look at the hashtag here, Black Lives Matter. I will tell you that this is not a space here in Virtual Legality that is ever going to be espousing any hashtags, any groups. I am an individualist at my core. I know there's a lot of people that comment in my videos about what politics I have, and I do find it fascinating because in any given video, people come out and call me MAGA and also call me way too leftist to be having this video discussion. And I like that because I do think that we are too easily put into buckets. I think we are too willing to put other individuals who have a whole cadre of beliefs into very specific envelopes under very specific umbrellas. And I don't think really anybody kind of operates that way. But the reason you won't see Black Lives Matter here, the reason you won't see All Lives Matter or Antifa or hell, Gamergate in this space is because I am fervent in my belief that you can't control a group. You can't control something that you aren't an intimate part of. And very often these groups get co-opted by forces outside their control, not their fault necessarily. Well-meaning people, well-thought people with good ideas, with very political and passionate feelings on topic X or topic Y get co-opted by other individuals, bad actors that seek to do whatever they want or perhaps even undermine the message at issue. So no, I don't necessarily think if I were corporate counsel for one of these companies, I wouldn't be using hashtags like this, not necessarily out of any specific belief one way or the other, but because you just don't control how that hashtag is used. You don't control what the perception of that is. You don't control the people behind it. And because of that, I would be much more cautious if I were these corporations from adding the hashtag. You see that Disney didn't. Disney just talks about standing against racism in general. And frankly, maybe I've been blessed in my life. Maybe I've been blessed in those that I follow or that follow me or that I am friends with and my family. But I don't know anybody in my personal life that doesn't stand against racism. I don't know anybody in my personal life that stands against inclusion. I want everybody to be judged for their individual merits or weaknesses, depending on what you're judging, but not necessarily collectively, right? I don't certainly think that prejudice of any kind on a collective basis is warranted. And so I stand for everything that Disney stands for here, but I don't stand for it in a group. I don't stand for it under a hashtag or under a banner that could become something else tomorrow. I believe that answers are needed for all of these situations and not violence. I know this is going to be one of those controversial type places in this video because so many people came to me and said, hey, Rick, can you speak out in support of what's happening around the country? And I will say this, I believe in protest, in seeking civil discourse as a cornerstone of American society. I believe in it very, very strongly. You hear me say very often that I believe in the rule of law, and I do, and I feel that that rule of law has been abused very significantly by the state in these instances that we are talking about. I believe that is deserving of protest. I believe that is deserving of answers. I don't believe that violence gets us there. I believe that answers help get us there. Now, I pulled up a tweet from Justin Amash. You may love him. You may hate him. Full disclosure, I went to school with him. He and I were classmates at Michigan Law School. And he is introducing right now a bill called the Ending Qualified Immunity Act to eliminate qualified immunity and restore Americans' ability to obtain relief when police officers violate their constitutionally secured rights. And in his letter to Congress, he actually says what we've talked about in this video. He says the brutal killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police is merely the latest in a long line of incidents of egregious police misconduct. This pattern continues because police are legally, politically, and culturally insulated from consequences for violating the rights of the people whom they have sworn to serve. He is, in my opinion, 100% correct on this score. And like I said, you may love him, you may hate him. Even the worst person in the world has the right opinion occasionally, right, Justin Amash haters? And this is the kind of thing that should be happening across the country. This is the kind of thing that a lawyer, somebody that is ensconced in the rule of law, wants to see society survive on those strictures, should be advancing. I support this. I support Justin Amash in this. I support those folks that seek to look at how militarized the police are, what their contracts should be, whether we should be negotiating public sector contracts with those kinds of service providers like the police. I believe that violence ultimately winds up getting you the exact opposite place to where you want to go. It does more harm than good. I do not exempt the police from this equation. I have seen the videos of them advancing and agitating certain of these protest situations in the various counties and cities in which they are operating. I believe that there is blame to go around on both sides. I believe that certain peaceful protests have been co-opted by folks that are more anarchist, that maybe want just to loot or want to riot. And I am very sympathetic, empathetic, and supportive of those videos and images that we see of the peaceful protesters trying to prevent public destruction, trying to prevent things from getting out of control. It is a very, very difficult situation, and I apologize to any that look at this video and think that I'm not backing up what they want me to back up. I can only be me. I can only tell you what I believe on these things. And ultimately, I believe in America. And I believe in Americans, and I believe that they both deserve far better than they have received from those that create the laws, those that administer the laws, and sure as hell, those that police the laws. This has been Virtual Legality for today. Thank you so much for watching. Virtual Legality is a YouTube video series with audio podcast versions presented as commentary and for education and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you have legal questions about the topics discussed, please consult your own legal counsel.